welcome to Brew Tap Cast. I am Tap here with a little bit of a change in what we normally do. We're going to do a video about Flesh and Blood. This is a new TCG from Legend Story Studios that released about a year ago, a little bit over a year ago in 2019. This is the first day of 2021, so that's our time frame right now. This is a really neat new game. It's really fresh. It's kind of unique. It's exciting to me. Definitely new material that I'm just really excited about, and so we wanted to start making videos for gameplay wise, theory wise, whatever. It's a really exciting game, and I hope that people can pick it up and get into it and become a bigger game because it's a really exciting thing. And I wanted to originally the idea behind this video was to talk about some specific interactions for the game and how they relate to me as a Magic player entering into Flesh and Blood. And that quickly became a bigger feat than I expected in the sense of it's actually kind of difficult to talk about little teeny rules when you don't know any of the rules. So it morphed into a rules overview. So with an MTG commentary in the sense of like learning the parallels and how to transition if you want to play Flesh and Blood, your rules knowledge of Magic and those sorts of skill sets, and then pivoting that into Flesh and Blood. So that's what this video is going to be about. Then we'll talk a little bit about how I think of it as a Magic player, and well as a little bit of ways to play and those sorts of things. So overall, going to be a little bit bigger of a video than I expected, but hopefully it's still condensed and accessible. So let's just right off the base just talk about basics. So what is this game? This game is a game where you are playing a hero and you are trying to defeat the opponent's hero, get them to 0 life, essentially. There are a bunch of different heroes. Currently, there are 15 heroes, 10 classes of heroes, variety of different ones. So it provides a lot of a different sort of play style for whichever class hero you take. And that's likely to increase as time goes on. So I imagine for the next couple sets, or at least just the next set, Monarch coming out in April or so, there'll probably be some more heroes. Maybe not new classes. Maybe new classes. That would be neat. But I expect them to release consistently new heroes and maybe new classes of heroes. But essentially, you're trying to defeat your opponent's hero, bring them to 0 life. Just like in Magic, do the same sort of thing, bring your opponent to 0 life. You can sort of think of this game as a weird version of Commander in Magic, in the sense that you are your hero, you are this commander of your game, and it's going to restrict the certain set of cards that you can actually play as a certain hero. So in that sense, there's that parallel to Commander there. So with that commander comes a starting life total that is different between commanders sometimes, and a starting hand size or intellect. So that's going to sort of dictate where you start as far as cards and life total. And you can sort of think of this also as the Vanguard cards. So back when they used to make those Vanguard cards, they were oversized Magic cards that were large, and they gave you a stipulation on hand size and starting life total, and then they gave you a special ability. So that's sort of exactly like the hero that you start with, except it's not really the same sort of gameplay as that because it's still a different game. But think of it as your Vanguard hero if you're looking for a Magic parallel for the hero there. So they can wear armor and they can have weapons. So essentially, there's a little playmats sort of version that I'm going to throw up on the screen that just tells you where you place things, and those sorts of things are on the battlefield. So your hero, your weapons, your head, chest, arm, and leg piece of armor all start on the battlefield at the beginning. So as you can see, these areas, that's where you're going to have things that just, you don't have to play them, you don't have to do anything, you choose them, and then they start the game in play. The other places on this board are the Arsenal, which we'll talk about later in the game, Pitch Zone, Graveyard, Deck, and the Banished Zone. So as I mentioned before, the cards that you can play are limited to, in some capacity, the class and even the hero that you play. So you can play a Guardian deck with, say, Bravo as your hero. And then, yes, there's a set of Guardian cards that only Guardian heroes can play. And there's also a subset of those that are Bravo cards. Only a Bravo hero can play. So those are sort of where your restrictions come in, as what cards you can play. But there's also cards that any deck can play that are generic cards as well. So those can make up a good portion of your deck. They maybe aren't, the most impactful as what your hero is trying to do and what your class is trying to do, but they do fill out the gaps, and sometimes they are very good, very important cards. All right, so that's sort of like the basic of the, how the board's going to get laid out and what we're going to do. Now we want to talk about the phases a little bit just before we get into cards. So there's phases just like in Magic that you have your start of turn phase, your action phase, and your end of turn phase. Start of turn phase is similar to your upkeep. in Magic. You're going to have triggers that will go off then. You'll have triggers that shut off then. That sort of thing. Action phase is sort of like a combination of pre-combat, combat, and post-combat phases, but the order is not necessarily so linear. You can sort of do attacks, you can do non-attacks, you can do attacks again. So it's sort of this give and take, and so it's sort of like your entire what's not the start and what's not the end of your turn in relation to Magic. The end of turn phase is essentially like your cleanup or your downkeep, whatever you want to call it, where you're going to in Magic you discard to hand size and combat damage would wash off. Those sorts of things happen in your end of turn phase in Flesh and Blood. Although you actually draw up to your full hand size in your end phase, so that's something that's a little bit different in that regard. All right, that was a little bit of an overview on the phases. We'll talk a little bit more about them later, but let's talk about playing the cards. So what are you doing? The cards that you have in your hand and in your deck, whatever, how do you actually do something with them? Well, each card has a cost that is represented in the top right. It's the circle with red that has a number. And that's how many resource points the card actually takes to play. In this particular game, there are no like hero-based or class-based resource points. Resource point is a resource point is a resource point. So there's no pips, there's no kinds of resource points, it's all the same thing. So it doesn't matter what card you use to pay for that, it's always going to be the same sort of resource point. So how do you pay for those? Well, the other top of the cards, that top left portion, has a little set of circles that are either filled in with amounts of red or not. And that's going to be how much it actually pitches for, 1, 2, or 3, depending on how many of those circles are filled in with red. There's also a nice little color bar at the top of the card as well. Red, yellow, or blue, that's going to dictate that number as well. Red pitches for 1, blue pitches for 3, and yellow's in the middle at a pitch for 2. So those are the way you get resource points to pay for the costs in the top right of certain cards. So you can pitch a card for a certain set of resource points, and then play a card that is equal to or less than those resource points. That's when you use those resource points. I mentioned the word pitching. So what is pitching? Well, if we look back at our playmat, we can see that there's a pitch zone. And unlike Magic, Flesh and Blood doesn't have a consistently increasing set of resources. Like you play lands every turn throughout the game, you have this mana pool that grows and grows and grows and grows. Flesh and Blood doesn't have that. You basically use cards from your hand to pay for things, or you have things on your board that can produce resource points at certain times. So the pitch zone is how you take cards from your hand, turn those into resource points, to pay costs on other cards you want to play. So basically, I don't want to say discard, because you're not discarding to the pitch zone. You're placing them in the pitch zone. You're converting them into resources. That card will eventually go to the bottom of your library. So it's not like it's gone forever or just in the graveyard not to be used again. It actually gets recycled back into your deck. And this is something that's really cool about Flesh and Blood. You can use cards to pay for other cards, and you eventually get to play those as well. So there's this neat sort of resource recycling system that's very unique for this game. I think it's actually quite neat and exciting. So that's what pitching is. It's basically putting a card from your hand to the pitch zone and generating resources to play other cards with that card. So what kind of cards are there to play? Well, I believe at this time there are 7 types of cards. 3 we've already discussed. We have your hero, your weapon, and your armor classes of cards. There's a whole bunch of different ones of those, so those are like their own set of cards. There are also 4 other sets of cards that we're going to talk about today, and I think for right now, I don't think there's any more. So there are action, attack reaction, defense reaction, and instant. And within that action card, there are 4 sort of subtypes. There's attack action, non-attack action, aura, and item. Those may increase over the time. I'm sure that they will be creating more space in the game for more things to be in that, but currently there are only those sort of subtypes of cards. So we'll talk about when you can play these different ones in a different or at different times, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But before we do that, can you just play as many cards in your hand as you want? Like, if I have enough resources to play, like, all of the cards in my hand, can I just, like, throw them up on the board? No, you can't. It's not necessarily as easy as that. There's also this sort of pace system that is in the game as well that is dictated by action points. So this is something that Magic doesn't really have any parallel to. There are certain effects that can make you only able to play 1 spell per turn or whatever. But overall, Magic doesn't have any restrictions built into the game that, like, you can't just do as many things as you want. There isn't a restriction there. Flesh and Blood is a little bit different, and I don't think it's really meant to be a restrictive thing. It's more meant to be, this is how the game is played, and that's what makes the different cards sort of more exciting to play with each other, is because the things can be really powerful, but maybe it's the only thing you get to play for a turn and those sorts of things. And there's ways to get around that sometimes too. So action points. So at the beginning of your action phase, you gain 1 action point. That means you can play 1 card that requires an action point to play, which is going to be anything that is an action card, or maybe an an armor effect or a weapon you have. Those will cost an action point to actually do something with or attack with. So in that case, it's not only cards from your hand that cost action points, it can be onboard effects that do that as well. As of now, I don't believe there are any cards that actually require more than 1 action point to actually play. I'm sure they'll explore that space in the future, but right now, you get your 1 action point, you can use it to play any card. I don't think there's anything that, I mean, they may cost more resources that you can provide, but I don't believe there's anything that requires multiple action points at this time. So I used my 1 action point, I played a card. My turn over? Not necessarily. So there are ways to get more action points as your turn goes on. Some things, again, you can have onboard effects that can give you another action point, but the key phrase that you're looking for on certain cards is go again. So you can see it's this in black bold letters on the card, go again. Essentially what that means is when the card that has go again resolves, add 1 action point to your pool, or whatever you want to call it. That gives you the ability to play something else. That's the whole thing about action points now. Not all cards require actions, or action points, I should say. Only the action cards require action points, and some will regenerate an action point for you. But there's ones that never need an action point no matter what. Those are going to be your attack reaction, defense reaction, and instance. Those essentially can be played for any amount of resource points that are required, but have no action point requirement. So you can play them at any time in the sense of when those cards are available to be played. Instance, just like in Magic, you play them anytime you want, as long as you have priority. And priority is a thing just like it is in Magic. You have that passing it back and forth between players to resolve phases and layers and things like that. Instance can happen anytime you have priority in response to anything. So think of instant as the same between the 2 games. Defense reaction and attack reaction, those are going to be certain times you can play those, but they don't require action points to be played. So before we go into any more of those 3 card types, let's talk about the action cards. So we mentioned before that there are 4 subtypes. There are attack action, non-attack action, aura, and item. So these are all, again, going to require an action point to play, and then have some onboard effect, or again, it's something on board that you can use that action point for. But those aren't necessarily going to be the ones that you play. Those could be armor and things like that. So let's start with non-attack action. This is going to be your basic action card. So at the bottom, it's just going to say action something, or it's just going to have action in the name, and it will not have the word attack. And that's really how you know it's not an attack action. It's just the word attack is omitted. Again, these can be specific to hero or class, so that's not like, it's not going to be like it's only going to say action on something. It could be Runeblade action. It could be Guardian action. So just remember that if it doesn't say attack, it's not an attack action. And that's important because a lot of cards are looking at what kind of actions that you've taken. So you got to make sure that you're aware that, oh, is this an attack action or a non-attack action, or an aura or an item? So essentially these non-attack action cards are essentially they do something and then they resolve, and that's kind of it. There's no damage dealt to your opponent or anything like that. And a lot of times they're going to have go again because maybe some of them are pump cards that are going to pump an attack that you're going to do later, or it's going to generate a resource point or something, and then you want to be able to do something after that card resolves. And so many of them will have go again, and that's kind of sensible because maybe your turn wants to be doing something that's a non-attack action and then an attack action. For example, lead the charge. It's a generic action, so you can play it with any class or hero. It's non-attack because, again, you don't see attack in that bottom bar. You play it, and it says the next time you play an action card with cost of 2 or greater, or some variation of that, you gain 1 action point, and it has go again. So essentially what that's saying is that I have 1 action point for my beginning of my action phase. I play lead the charge, I pay any cost if it has any cost. I then have it resolve, and it says, cool, you got go again, so you're going to gain 1 action point. And then the next thing you do that meets the cost, whether it's, attack action card of 2 or greater, when that resolves, you'll also gain 1 action point. So it gives that other thing go again, essentially. So that's an example of sort of your generic, action, non-attack action card. So another one is auras. So, and we'll talk about attacks later because they're more maybe a bread and butter sort of thing. So we'll just go through these other ones first. So auras, You can think of these sort of as enchantments in Magic, except for we use the term in Magic as aura as something that's going to enchant something, not aura in this case where it's just something that goes in the battlefield. So it's more of your base kind of enchantment. In Magic the Gathering are these auras in Flesh and Blood. So it's something that just enters, sits there, can have some immediate effect, it can have some later effect, it can do something, but it doesn't sort of attach to anything like we would do it in Magic. Um, so sometimes these have go again, sometimes they don't, sometimes they can damage things or do certain things, but there's sort of a variety of different things that they do, but they sort of sit and play. For the most part, the ones that I've seen you'll play them out, they sit and play for that turn, and the next turn they generally have some trigger or something, or you need to have, hit for damage or something like that, and they trigger something, and then they generally disappear, or they are destroyed, go to the graveyard, that sort of thing. I'm sure there are ones that last more than that, and I just don't remember them right now. All right, so the other action item that we're going to talk about, or action card we're going to talk about, is item. So these are going to have generic action and then item. Or maybe it's not generic action. Maybe it's a mechanologist action item. So there are these things that you play to the board. There's not a really great parallel between Magic and Flesh and Blood for these. I guess you could think of them as an enchantment or an artifact, something that is going to stick around essentially indefinitely unless your opponent destroys it or you destroy it for using, or it runs out of something and then it needs to be, put in the graveyard or something like that. So that's sort of the best parallel we have. But for the most part, these, cost an action point to play. They don't always give it back to you. Some of them do, some of them don't. But they just sort of sit and play until you want to use them. In some cases, using them also requires an action point. Sometimes if they do require an action point, it'll give you go again. Sometimes it won't. So they'll have some effect. You can use it when you want. So you're basically front loading. All right, well, I'm going to use my action point this turn to maybe give myself more bonus next turn. So you don't actually have the extra action points to keep doing things afterwards. It's sort of setting up for bigger turns. So those are your items right now. I don't know if the game's hugely focused around items, but there's a big space that they can use that for, and I think certain heroes are obviously more wanting to use those things as well. All right, so that fourth subtype, the one that's probably going to account for most decks, is your attack action. So you can sort of think of these as your creatures from Magic the Gathering. However, they're not really creatures in the sense that they don't stay in play for multiple turns. You pay for the cost, you play the card, and then you put it on the chain and it attacks. You're doing the thing. The card resolves. Once it resolves, it's sort of basically essentially a dead card until the end of the turn where it is put in the graveyard. So they're not really like creatures in the sense of the creatures most of the time in Magic will stay on the board. You can repeatedly hit your opponent with them each turn, that sort of thing. There's no regular cadence to attack action cards like that. Your weapon, however, is something that is repeatable. You can pitch to swing with your weapon, hit with your weapon, shoot with your weapon, whatever you want to call it. And that's going to be repeatable in the sense of, yes, maybe they are limited to once per turn, but the next turn, it's not gone. You play it to the chain, and it comes back to its weapon slot after that. So it's not going to the graveyard. It's repeatable in that regard. Attack action cards, on the other hand, are going to, unless they say otherwise, essentially be played out, resolve, and then go to the graveyard. And that's a little bit of a difference between those two types. All right, so we talked about the different kinds of action cards that require action points. Let's go back to those other ones that don't require action points. So we talked about instants. You play them anytime you have priority. Enough said. They may have a resource cost, they may not, whatever. The other two are attack reaction and defense reaction. These are somewhat self-explanatory by their names. Attack reactions are reacting to your attack, or to your attack, or your defense reaction is reacting to a defense that you play. And sort of those are the differences. You can think of these as your combat tricks, and we'll talk about the phase of how these play later. But attack reaction cards are meant to bump bonus, make your attack stronger. Defense reactions are made to make your defense stronger. So yeah, these are your combat tricks. Essentially sort of pumping power versus pumping toughness, that sort of thing. That's kind of a different little thing that's just for Magic from Flesh and Blood that doesn't really parallel right over, because they are regimented. There's only certain phases you can cast them, whereas combat tricks, although you call them combat tricks, they're instants or whatever. Sometimes they're sorceries if they're not combat tricks. Those are sorts of cards that you can play essentially all the time if they're instants, or during your main phases if they're sorceries, but they can do the same sorts of things that they do, that the attack and defense reaction cards do in Flesh and Blood, but you're restricted on when you can cast them in Flesh and Blood. All right, so earlier we talked about how cards have a cost and a pitch value in that color bar at the top. We also want to mention that they do for attack action cards. They also have a damage. That bottom left, that little arrow or spear tip or whatever you want to call it, that yellow thing in the bottom left, has a number next to it. That is the attack value. So that's how much it's going to, when played to the chain, will deal damage if unblocked or partially blocked or whatever. That's your attack value. On the other side is your defense value. So this is if it's a non-defense reaction card, that number in the bottom next to that little gray shield is the amount of damage that can be sort of blocked by this card when it is played for free as a defense card. So, little important point that we maybe glossed over earlier. So, most cards are going to have defense value regardless of what they are. Some of them don't, and only attack cards will have a attack value on the bottom left. So, just want to make sure that we talk about that so that when we go into the more further chain talk, we know that right now. Okay, so we went over the different card types and those sorts of things, when or what they do and that kind of thing. We don't necessarily know when we can play them. So let's go back. Before we were talking about phases, let's go back to that. So, and that first one is your start of turn phase. So this is where, beginning of turn effects will happen, or things may stop because at the beginning of the next turn, this stops or whatever, those sort of things. And we have these parallels in Magic. Again, upkeep in Magic, you have things that stop during your upkeep, that trigger during your upkeep, those sorts of things. So that's going to be the same sort of thing. Once all of those things are resolved and they use something that's sort of similar to the stack we'll talk about just now, your action phase starts. So at the beginning of your action phase, you get your action point. So that's how you're going to play cards and do things and stuff like that. And then now let's talk about the sort of stack analog in Flesh and Blood called the chain. So you could think of the chain as the stack, but in Magic, the stack is they're sort of single instances of things. So if you play something, the stack starts, your opponent can respond with things, and it's sort of like the cards you play go up in the stack, and then they resolve, and then the stack sort of disappears. The stack is empty. In Flesh and Blood, the chain is somewhat static throughout the turn. As you play things to the chain, when they resolve, it doesn't sort of disappear, because sometimes things in the chain will look at other parts of the chain. And so it's important to know how many times you've played to the chain and that sort of thing. And so it's not really something that disappears once all the spells are resolved for a current set of priority switches. That's a little bit something that's kind of different, and I guess it gives you more space to play with, because you're, instead of blindly tracking things, like for instance, if you think of a Thousand Year Storm in Magic, or Storm, I guess you could say in general, you could be playing spells and you have to keep track of how many spells you've played and whether it's with a dice or whatever. In Flesh and Blood, the chain is sort of self-evident in the sense that it's laid out and that you have them there still. And then that's important because some cards are specifically looking for other cards on the chain. And so it's not only like, oh, well, did you play something else? Well, no, did you play this to the chain? And so that's something that we need to make sure that we keep, focused on, and that sort of stuff. So the chain is important. We get that, right? Pretty much most things use the chain. One thing that doesn't is the action point. So you gain an action point that doesn't use a chain. It just sort of, it happens. You don't really have a chance to deal with that. It just, boom, you got an action point. And I think this is cool because if everything's using the chain, that likely points towards in the future there may be some sort of counter magic. So in Magic the Gathering, you have counter spells, those sorts of things, counter target spell, whatever. It would be unsurprising if Flesh and Blood went into that realm. How deep they go, I have no idea, because a lot of times you get negative play experiences with people, especially when they first start the game, if you're getting counter spells all the time. And I get it, because like, you want to be able to play the game. You don't want to be told that you can't play your card because this other person told you couldn't play your card. And I get it, but it looks like that could be a possibility because, again, when everything uses the chain, you have that priority that needs to go back and forth between the players before something resolves. It gives you the chance to have that sort of thing. And there is some card, I'm blanking on the name right now, that essentially, I believe it's a warrior attack reaction, that you play it and it essentially bounces one of your opponent's, I think it's a defense card, back to their hand. So it's not really a counter spell because they don't lose the card, but it forces them to bring it back to their hand, and they can't actually use it for that particular instance because the time where they could use it has passed. So I also see that this could be a possibility of having counter spells that are literally like, put the current card, the card on the current stack layer in the graveyard, be done with it, sort of thing. So we'll see if they go that way, but who knows? The possibility is open. All right, so those are sort of like the intro to the chain and how that relates to the stack. So when you decide to play a non-attack action or anything really, you play it to the chain. So we'll talk about non-attack things. So forget about attacks right now because the language is a little bit different of how the chain works in that regard. So as I said, just like in Magic, priority is a thing. So as the turn player, you get your action point, you have priority, you can play something. So let's say, all right, I'd like to play a non-attack action, like lead the charge or whatever, to the chain. You play it on the chain, and your opponent, you have to pass priority back and forth. So like I played this and I passed priority. Your opponent has something to do about it if they want, whatever, and then it comes back to you. That means that that card is going to resolve on the chain. Will become a layer on the chain. That's the language there. That is, you play it, and then boom, you have a layer now. All right, so we talked about non-attack actions. So whether it's aura, item, or non-attack, generic, whatever. Attacks have a little bit of a different language to them. They'll get played to the chain, but when you play the chain, it opens a chain link. So what a chain link is it's how you're going to proceed with resolving that. So in the case of a non-attack, it's like I play it, you pass priority back and forth. If there's some sort of triggered effects, you're going to pass priority for that as well. But attack action cards have a little sort of set of sub phases in them. So let's say I play Barraging Brawnhide, a yellow version of Barraging Brawnhide, onto the chain. So I play that, it opens a chain link. So there are going to be several steps in there. There's the attack step, the defense step, the reaction step, the damage calculation, and then finally the resolution step, I believe it's called. Yeah, or chain link resolution. So obviously the attack one is I played this to the chain. It's happening. So people have priority, pass back and forth. You then go to the defense step. So if my Barraging Brawnhide is attacking for 6 damage, then my opponent's going to choose to defend with that. So they can play a defense card, such as, well, anything. Let's say my opponent also has a yellow version of Barraging Brawnhide in their hand. At the bottom right is the defense amount. They can play that as defense, so they're going to block this 6 attack card with 2. And so that's sort of when they can play their defense. It doesn't cost anything, so even though the spell says it costs 3, defending is always going to be free, provided you are defending with a non-defense reaction card. So if it's anything else, you can defend with it for free. Once all of the attacking, obviously single attack thing, defense has been, I'm defending with this card, or I'm defending with 3 cards, or 3 cards and my equipment and stuff on board, all that kind of stuff. You can do a mixture of that, again, for free, unless it's a defense reaction spell, which you can't actually play just yet. The defense step has to end, and then you go to the reaction step. So that this is where the active player who is attacking has a chance to play an attack reaction. So this is going to be, say, something that bumps their power up or something like that. When that is passed back and forth, the defending player also has the option to play a defense reaction spell. So these ones have a defense thing in the bottom right, like let's say Springboard Somersault, or let's go Sink Below, because that actually has a cost. So Sink Below is a card that has a cost, and you must pay it, even though it's got that defense thing, and just looks like any other card. You have to pay the cost on Sink Below to get that defense thing, and that's the only time you can do that, because it's a defense reaction spell, is when you're in your reaction step. Once all of those have been played, then it goes to damage calculation. So the attack power plus any attack buffs get added together. Your defense power and any defense buffs get added together, and if the attack is greater than the defense, that's the damage that the hero will take. And it's important to note that you should think as all attacks in Flesh and Blood have trample. So in Magic, trample means if I don't have enough defense to block an attack power attack, it's going to trample over and hit me. All of it is like that in Flesh and Blood. In Magic, 10-10 non-trample, blocked by 1-1, 0 damage to your opponent. 10-10 trample, blocked by 1-1, 9 damage, tramples over. Everything has trample in Flesh and Blood. Always think it does. There's no real reason to think it won't, because that's just how it is. So damage calculation happens. Then you go through the chain link resolution, where everything is resolved, through priority, pass back and forth. Boom, done, ready to move on to the next thing. All right, so that was the chain. Got a little bit of overview for that. So once all attacks and other action cards are all played, the end of turn, and someone is done with their turn, whether they still have resource points or action points, whatever. Maybe they don't want to do anything. Maybe they can't do anything. The end of turn phase starts. With that, they will trigger anything that happens at the end of turn. It will wipe away all resource and action points. They don't store up. They don't continue through turns. They are gone at the end of turn phase. No exceptions at this time. Again, could be card space that you can explore later in the game, and maybe LSS will actually put cards that allow you to, bank resource or action points. But that seems like in this game that'd be very, very overpowered, and they probably won't really do, or maybe there'll be caveats about it, whatever. But yeah, end of turn phase starts. You lose those points, you trigger different things, and then the other things that happen in that is that you have the chance to arsenal. So again, we talked way in the beginning when we saw that playmat, you have an arsenal zone. The arsenal zone is sort of like a extra card in hand sort of thing, in the sense of you can, at the end of your turn, if you have a card in your hand or multiple cards in your hand, you can put one of them face down in your arsenal zone if there's nothing in there already, and sort of draw up, not including that card, to your total hand size, your total intellect size. So it's a way to have an extra card in your hand. All heroes have the ability to do this. It's not just one or the other, whatever. All of them can. All of them have the arsenal. The caveat is that you cannot pitch from your arsenal zone. You can only play cards from your arsenal zone. So let's say I'm playing against a wizard. They don't ever actually attack with any attack action cards. So there's no damage that I can block with, say, a springboard somersault or anything like that. So if I have a springboard somersault, which is defense reaction, which again only blocks non-arcane damage, whereas all the wizard things are all arcane damage. If I put that in my arsenal, it's going to do literally nothing. It's going to be in there doing absolutely nothing, because I can't play that to the chain to defend anything, because it doesn't do anything. It literally, against a wizard, it doesn't do anything. I can't block arcane damage with it. So I was like, all right, well, I might as well pitch it. Well, I can't pitch from my arsenal zone. So I wouldn't want to arsenal that against a wizard, because it's going to do nothing. It's going to sit there. So that's the caveat. You can't pitch, you can only play. So, but in some cases, it's really, really helpful, because if you know it's a spell that you want to play, and you don't want to have maybe it get incidentally discarded by your opponent or something like that, you can put it in there. It's safe, and then you can say, all right, well, maybe it's really expensive, then I want to have 4 cards in my hand. I need to pitch to play it. Maybe it's something like that. So that's the special case of the arsenal. Once you've chosen to arsenal or not, you draw up to your full hand size, and the turn is over. The one caveat to drawing up at the end of the turn, normally it is only the active player who gets to draw full arsenal and draw fully up. Actually, the active player only gets the arsenal, but the active player only draws up. The defending or the other person, the non-active player, does not draw up to their full hand size at the end of the turn, except for on the first turn. So the first turn of the game, if I'm the active player and my opponent is not, we both can, I play a bunch of attacks, they defend, they use all their cards, I use all my cards. We both draw up to 4, but only for the first turn. Every turn after that, only the active player will draw up to their full intellect size. So we talked about phase, we talked about cards, how to play them, all that kind of stuff, when to play them. So again, your goal is to bring your opponent's hero's health to 0. So you're playing all these cards and all that kind of stuff to bring your opponent to 0, and that will end the game. All right, so those were the basics of the game. Play all the stuff, be done with the game. One other thing before we talk about how some more relations to MTG and stuff like that, I want to mention the colors of cards. So earlier we just talked about them having different pitch values, and that's the case. Red cards pitch for 1, yellow for 2, and blue for 3 resource points, as we saw. But there can also be different values for different parts of the card. So let's go back to our Barraging Brawnhide example. So Barraging Brawnhide has 3 varieties, and not all cards will have 3 varieties, but there is a yellow, red, and blue version of Barraging Brawnhide. So you'll notice that all the card costs are the same. So they each cost 3. They pitch for different values. So essentially, if you know that the blue one pitches for 3, the red one pitches for 1, if the cards were identical, there'd be very little reason to actually play anything but the blue version. But as you look into the card themselves, there is a difference between them. So your blue Barraging Brawnhide attacks for 5, defends for 2. Yellow attacks for 6, defends for 2. And red attacks for 7 and defends for 2. So generally, the red cards are going to be a lot more powerful. The blue cards are less powerful, and the yellow is in the middle. And this is the same thing for multiple kinds of cards. It also could be, if they're defensive cards, it could be that the red is going to defend for more, the middle will be yellow, and then the blue will defend for the least. And so you'll have different versions of that sort of thing. Or it could be, in this particular case, this is Bronzing Brawnhide is defended by less than 2 non-equipment cards. It gains +1. You could have that plus ability be more on a red and less on a blue. So that's just an important caveat. And I think this part of the game actually is very important, and it's very exciting because that does allow us for a larger variety of deck building. So there's only so many copies of each colored of, say, Barraging Brawnhide that you put in your deck, but it's really neat because it takes a single card essentially and expands upon it so that you can have more complexity in the game, which or not. You don't have to have that complexity, but it's something that's really interesting because it allows you to play different versions and like, all right, well, you know, I'm always going to want to play Barraging Brawnhide. Well, maybe I want to play more of the red ones and less of the blue ones because I still want to be able to pitch high value with the blue ones, but I really want to do more damage with the red ones. So maybe I'll play other cards for in a more blue version. I can always have Barraging Brawnhide that's really going to, go in for a big punch. So that's something important that you really want to make sure that you remember, and that, you're trying to remember all the cards. Know that sometimes the colors are going to change things that you might not remember. So always double check the statistics on each card depending on the color. So, all right. So those were all the basics. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about how Flesh and Blood for me relates to Magic, and some little like sort of heuristics or shortcuts that I can use, and maybe other Magic players can use to sort of get into this game and learn a little bit and sort of stumble through those things there. So the first one, and I think it's sort of self-evident, there's no summoning sickness here. So you don't actually play creatures per se in this game. You're playing attacks. In the case of Barraging Brawnhide that we just talked about, that looks like a creature, right? It's just attack and a generic attack action. So it's just something that's going to be play the chain. It's going to resolve at the end of turn. It's just going to go away to the graveyard. So there isn't summoning sickness. There's nothing that really, maybe there will be in the future, but there's nothing that really is an attack card that you sort of play and doesn't do anything. It stays around or it's repeated or anything like that. The closest thing to that is your weapon. It's a repeated source of damage that you just feed pitch resource value cards to, and then you swing with, or you stab with, or you chop with, or you whatever, scratch with. Those are your best source of repeated attacks that you can think of as close to a creature. And there's no summoning sickness. You can use it turn 1, you can use it turn 10, whatever. So yeah, no summoning sickness. Another one, milling or losing to decking. There isn't anything like that in this game. You can run out of cards, but you don't lose the game because you can't draw your cards. That's not how the game ends. That said, generally, if you run out of cards to draw, you're going to lose the game because that means you can't play cards to attack or pay or pitch for value to attack with your weapon. You can't defend cards that your opponent's attacking with. So generally, you're going to lose the game because you don't have anything to really do. But again, you don't lose from decking, but you can get around that in certain cases. So like there's a card called Drone of Brutality that when it's put in the graveyard from anywhere, it goes to the bottom of your deck. So let's say you had 2 of them. You could pitch one to play the other one will resolve, go to the graveyard. The pitch one will go to the bottom, but then the one that went to the graveyard actually go to the deck. So you just have those 2 cards, and you sort of can just cycle through those for the whole game. But you don't lose the game by decking. And in this particular case, when you hit no cards in your library, it's called fatigue. So you run out of cards to play because either you defended with too many, you played too many, you boosted too many, you banished too many, whatever. You run out of cards, you are fatigued, and you don't have any more resources to do anything with. So that's that. Another thing to remember between these 2 games, it's a more of a non-parallel than anything else. There isn't really a curve that you're going for in Flesh and Blood. So in Magic, you want to have this, like say you're playing a mono red aggro deck, and you want to just like slam and go, 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 go. You want to have a curve that's going to give you maybe 1 or 2 lands, and you're going to have a 1-drop, a 2-drop, and then maybe a 2-drop and a 1-drop, or a 3-drop, and then like you cap off at that low, maybe 3, or as your top mana cost in a card, and you can just go bam, bam, bam every turn, curve out, empty your hand, and then just force actions on the board, that sort of thing. Flesh and Blood doesn't really have that per se, mostly because you're not gaining those resources as time goes on. You're not slowly increasing progressively as the game goes. I'm pitching each turn, and I'm gaining resource value at that time for that turn. So yes, you can absolutely have better hands or worse hands. You can have more progressive action hands or more defensive, less attacking hands, and that's totally part of the game, but isn't really about a curve to I want to do bam, bam, bam. I mean, yes, you can have your game plan do that, but it's not really a curve you need to really worry about. Like, it just isn't as much of a thing. Like playing your cards in the right order, of course, makes sense, and you want to maybe craft your hand in a way for a really good hand by maybe pitching away something that doesn't work with the rest of your hand, or arsenaling something that maybe you don't want to have in your hand or something like that. But there's no real curve for that. There's definitely just as much, if not more, importance on play pattern, but not a curve pattern per se. And that gets into a little bit about the philosophy of how to build a deck, and I'm still learning that, and that'll be hopefully a future video that I can learn a little bit more and make a video about. Essentially, there should be some sort of balance between average pitch cost, or sorry, average pitch value and average cost of your cards. Suffice to say, for now, just smashing in X red cards, Y blue cards, and Z yellow cards probably won't be the thing for every single deck. It just won't work for every single deck. It might work for some, but it's not like, oh, it is X% red pitch, X% blue pitch, and X% yellow pitch. It's not going to be like that. So that's kind of important to know. And hopefully I'll master that enough to try to make a video coming soon. The last little connection point is about crafting your deck. You should be crafting your deck in a way that you have a game plan. So if you want to build a deck that is going to be aggressive and destroy your opponent very quickly, then you want to build your deck with more aggressive cards. You want to make sure that you're putting in cards that will allow you to pay for those cards that you want to play every turn. You don't want to maybe say take a turn off just to build something up. That's not what you want to do. You want to play something every turn and continually do that, pitching in for a little bit of damage, you know, here or there, whatever. Like, let's think about how you build your deck for a Katsu. So Katsu's hero ability has something to do with combo. So what would make sense is that you play a bunch of combo cards, right? Because if it's going to allow you to, you know, get combo cards, and you have 0 combo cards in your deck, you didn't build your deck with a plan. Otherwise, you shouldn't have played Katsu. You should have played a different ninja if you wanted to play ninja cards. So have a plan for your deck. Make sure the cards in your deck go with your plan, and make sure you utilize your hero's abilities, because it's a big part of the game. You can have a lot of power in those hero abilities. So make sure your deck has a plan. The same goes for the actual way you play. So have a plan in the games themselves. Like, make sure that you're paying attention. Obviously, you need to have, you know, more memory than just the turn you have. Oh, cool! I drew my 4 cards. Bang, bang, bang. Cool. I'm doing great. I'm using all my cards every turn. I'm pitching in for damage, all that kind of cool stuff. Make sure that that lines up with the whole game plan as well. Have memory, have forethought, have have hindsight. Like, I was doing this for the first half of the game, and now maybe it's not working. Maybe I need to change change it up. Like, be able to adjust in real time. Think of Michael Flores' article about who's the beatdown. That was about who's if you're both aggro decks, who's really the beatdown? Who's the one who's going to be more aggressive, and who needs to switch their pattern and be more defensive? So the same goes for this game. If you're playing against 2 aggressive decks, or if you see your opponent who's maybe playing non-aggressive deck do things that don't make sense, or change things that you need to be able to change as well. So always be live to those changes, and make sure you're paying attention to that. All right, let's talk a little bit about pros and cons of the game. Just, this is more of a personal feeling about the game right now. One thing I really like about Flesh and Blood, and this is definitely right in comparison to Magic the Gathering, is I feel as though as long as you know a little bit about how to make a deck, or you're given a deck to play that is, you know, properly constructed, you're a lot less likely to get mana screwed or mana flooded. It's just a different, because the resource type is a resource game is different. You're not drawing lands in Magic, or all you're drawing is lands in Magic. You just really can't do anything then. With Flesh and Blood, the resource values on cards make you able to do something almost every turn. So yes, a card that you want to play can also be used to play other cards. So you have this nice balance of, like, cool, I'm going to pitch this and play it later so I can play something else now. Or at the very least, say you don't have enough pitch value in your hand to play any of the cards in your hand because they're super expensive and they're all red or whatever, you can pitch them to swing with your weapon. So there's a lot of things to do, and there's a lot of ways to have resources for that. So obviously, if you build your deck wrong and you have, like, all red pitch value cards for all really expensive cards, yeah, you're going to have a bad time. It's not going to work out well. But you can get around that, like, as long as you have some basic idea of what you're doing, or you're given like a pre-constructed deck from LSS or whatever, you'll have a better time doing that sort of thing. So there's just always more Magic to play. I should say more Flesh and Blood to play. Whenever I play Magic, I want to play Magic. I don't want to shuffle up, draw cards, and then just play lands or discard cards to hand size. Like, I want to play the game. And Flesh and Blood seems like you're more often going to play the game. And that's something that I really like about it. Another thing that's really cool about it, there's a variety to play, variety of ways to play. When Magic first came out, there wasn't a large amount of ways to play. It was generally just constructed. They didn't really have a lot of names for it, like they had, type 1, type 2, whatever. That was as the game grew. But otherwise, it was like you just shuffle cards together and you play. Right off the bat, there's limited, so they have sealed and draft for this game. You have Blitz, which is a 40 card short, like 15, 20 minute sort of game style. You have Classic Constructed, which is a 60 card, 30 minutes to an hour, something like that. And then they have your sort of Commander analog Ultimate Pit Fight, which could be as many people as you want, and that can go on for a long time. There's politics there, all that kind of stuff. So you have that that cool Commander type aspect, or fast paced, small deck size, or skill based sealed drafts, stuff like that. So that's really cool. For cons, right now the supply is very bad for this game. I don't think that's necessarily the fault of Legend Story Studios. I think it's they released this game in a pandemic, which is not a great time to try to start something, bring something off the ground. So it came out late 2019. That was just before the pandemic really started hitting hard. And so trying to get the sets printed has been probably pretty difficult. Logistics and shipping has been very difficult, expensive, that kind of stuff. So the supply is not meeting demand, and that's inadvertently causing a lot of other issues as well. So if people are buying all the stock up and trying to sell them for exorbitant prices, which is absolutely happening right now, that's going to be a barrier to entry. So you're going to have a lot of people who like, cool, oh man, I heard about Flesh and Blood. Like, you go to your local game store, they, well, I don't carry it, I don't know what it is, I can't get it. And then you go online, like, all right, cool. Like, these basic decks right now, there's, I think MSRP was what, like $10 or something like that, something like that, like $10, right? And then now they're like, they're stupid amounts. If you can even find them, they're stupid amounts of money for a single 60 card deck with no cards that are really hard to come by. There's no like ultra mega or super rare cards in there, but it's super expensive because there just isn't a lot of cards out there. And like, you get these chase legendaries that are expensive, but they probably will stay expensive, but they probably shouldn't be as much as they are. It's kind of ridiculous. Like, I get the fabled cards, those like, the ones that they don't tell you how many there are in existence, that being exorbitant prices for first edition or whatever, because there's literally not that many. That's not because the supply is low. That's because they just don't print a lot of them. But when you can't get your commons because my internet store, because I don't have a local game store, is selling a box of unlimited Welcome to Wraith for like $200, like, I don't want to play that game. That's not economically feasible for me to play that game. So ultimately, that either leads people to not play, or people that buy singles, which is actually, for this game at this time with the supplies, probably a better way to go about it, especially for budget plays. Additionally, you'll probably find a bunch of free cards around on Facebook groups or Discords or things like that, of like, you open a couple boxes, you're going to have play sets of all the commons. And again, you can play with commons. They're fun to play with. They're sometimes necessary to play with. So in that regard, hopefully the supply will increase as printing gets better planned or more possible, with a pandemic hopefully going down in pressure, that sort of thing. And hopefully that will bring prices down. Hopefully that will increase accessibility. We'll have a thriving community in that regard. The other thing is that it is a pandemic, and this game was supposed to be played in the flesh and blood, hence the name. They from the start, they said, this is not a digital game, and it won't be a digital game. This is a flesh and blood, to be played in the flesh and blood. So in that regard, kind of a hard time for a game to be, that's supposed to be played in person, to be played right now. And that's kind of to its credit, whether or not it's just like a fad or like some new collector hoarding thing. The game's blown up like really big in a time where it's really hard to play in person. So in that regard, that's pretty cool. And that hopefully that shows that it's not just people trying to invest in it and hoarding boxes and all that kind of stuff. hopefully it's just people really want to play because it's a fun game. And I think, in my opinion, I think that's what it is. And I'm looking forward to trying to actually play in person and have fun in person when it's safe. For right now, I'm going to try to start playing on Tabletop Simulator, through Spell Table, those sorts of things. And again, that's a little bit more difficult, but at least we can get our feet under us. And then when things are safe, we can go out and play more in the future. All right, so a little bit of a sum up here for my thoughts about the game. I know I've been sharing them as we go, but big thing for me. This is a new, different, and exciting game. It's enough different from Magic, and it's interesting enough that it's really grasped me quite hard. I particularly like the resource system. The fact that you can be pitching these cards to play later is really neat and unique, in my opinion. I'm not like this TCG master or anything like that, but it's so, to me, it's so new and fresh, and it's a cool idea that, like, you're not dedicating, say almost a third of your deck to these cards that only do one thing, and they can only be used for one thing. I like that you can use cards to pay for other cards, and then play those cards later. And that's really cool to me. I also like the variety of gameplay that you can get. So you have a bunch of different heroes, you have a bunch of different classes, you can play them in different ways, you can play against people of different kinds, and it's sort of neat how you can have all those different unique aspects to it. And that's something that Magic doesn't really have. They have play styles and deck types, but the heroes are even more of a granular way to tweak things and twist the knobs and have fun in your own sort of own way. I like that commons are really playable. Um, Most Magic decks these days, if you want to be very competitive or even like somewhat competitive, like trying to play on Arena right now in the standard ladder, you know, you're maybe, silver, gold, or like, you can get away with sort of most things. But once you hit platinum, diamond, those sorts of things, you need a deck that's expensive to do well. It's saturated with mythics and rares, and you just can't necessarily do that. A lot of the commons are very playable and function well in Flesh and Blood, and that's really cool. Sure, you're looking to be top tier competitive, you're going to have to get the legendaries, the majestics, probably not the fables. Doesn't seem like the fables are really needed, which is a again a merit for there as well. But I think most people aren't going to be top ranked or trying to be top ranked players. They're just trying to have fun. So that's something I like about the game. A few things I like about the game. The other thing that's really neat, and it's not really game related, the lore. So the backdrop of this entire video has been this lovely map that Legend Story Studios had made. That is their world. What's really cool about that is they said when they were making this, it took them like 7 years to go from concept to actually releasing the game. They have a lot of lore built in that they are just going to slowly peel back layers and reveal and build into, and again build on. Even though they spent 7 years making it, and still build it as you go. So they have this deep lore, this beautiful art that is really expansive and exploitable for excitement. And so that's something, like, although it's not for gameplay, like maybe people are just spikes for gameplay, like to win, whatever. But I like to have pretty cards. I like to have cool stories. It sort of intertwines to make a really exciting game for me, anyways. So I think that's going to sort of wrap up the video. I really hope you liked the video. I hope that you stuck through it. I really want to play this game a lot more. I want to make more videos of this game. I want to try to make a lot more content on it. So, near future is probably going to be some deck techs, budget versions, things like that. And then moving on to maybe some philosophy of deck building videos and things like that. And then gameplay in general, probably through tabletop or spell table. But that's sort of the whole thing. So again, this was meant to be a little like, hey, if you're playing Magic and you want to play Flesh and Blood, here's like these 3 minutes of me thinking of like how the relations are, and pivot yourself here so you can better understand the rules, that sort of stuff. And then it turned into this, however long this video is going to be, about the whole rules overview sort of thing. In any case, let me know if I got anything wrong. I am by no means a very awesome explicit player, and there's not really a comprehensive rule book yet. They have some rules out there, but I feel like there's parts that I can't really answer just yet or understand because I haven't played it enough. Let me know if I'm wrong. Let me know if you agree with me. Let me know if you don't. Teach me things, whatever. Leave some comments. If you liked it, subscribe, whatever. Just I just want to interact with this game, interact with other people about this game because it seems really fun. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I enjoyed making it, and hope that I can see you guys soon. So thank you very much, and cheers.